Richard Hayes was a billionaire admired by the world, yet all his power could not protect the one person who needed him most. Richard Hayes returned to his mansion on the outskirts of New York, and that night felt unusually silent. The golden lights stretched across the marble hallway, cold and unwelcoming. No music, no laughter, only a suffocating stillness. At the small room at the end of the hall, Naomi, his pregnant wife, sat curled up beside the unfinished crib. Her thin shoulders trembled. Tears streamed down her face, exposing the bruises etched into her skin. The sight made Richard stop in his tracks, his chest tightening with pain. Naomi lifted her eyes, red and swollen, and whispered a question that struck him harder than any boardroom defeat. "Am I so ugly that I'm only worth being seen as a monkey in this house?" That single sentence pierced Richard's heart, the heart of a man who once believed he had built the perfect family. Yet behind the glittering facade of wealth and power lay a sorrow he had never imagined. And this was only the beginning. If this story already stirs something inside you, stay with us until the end. Because sometimes, the battles fought behind closed doors cut deeper than any storm outside. Richard Hayes had always believed he built the perfect life. To the world outside, he was a symbol of success. His name appeared on magazine covers. Reporters praised his vision, his empire, his influence. He was the man who had it all. Money, reputation, power, everything people spent their lives chasing seemed to rest in the palm of his hand. Yet, the silence inside his home told another story. Behind the glass windows and manicured lawns, the air felt heavy. Rooms looked polished but empty. The grand dining table stood set, but no laughter echoed across it. Every corner carried the weight of absence, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Richard loosened his tie, the way he always did after a long day. It was a ritual meant to bring comfort, but tonight it felt hollow. The marble floors reflected his steps back at him, sharp and cold. For a man applauded by the world, he suddenly felt like a stranger in his own house. What use were riches, he thought, when warmth could not be bought? What worth was reputation if the woman he loved sat trembling in the shadows? The truth gnawed at him. Perfection was only a mask, and it was beginning to crack. Naomi sat in the dim light of the nursery, her body curled in on itself. The unfinished crib beside her was meant to hold new life, yet it stood as a reminder of how fragile everything had become. Her face, once bright and full of laughter, now carried the faint marks of bruises that had not yet faded. The soft glow from the lamp revealed every trace, painting her sorrow in quiet detail. She rested one hand across her stomach, protective, as though shielding the child inside from the world outside. The other hand trembled slightly, fingers brushing against her cheek where the skin still ached. Naomi was gentle, always calm, the kind of woman who carried kindness in her voice, but tonight her silence spoke more than words could. Richard watched her carefully. He wanted to ask, to demand, but the heaviness in her eyes held him back. The distance between them felt wider than the hallway he had just crossed. In that moment, the man who owned so much realized how powerless he truly was. And Naomi, though surrounded by wealth, sat wrapped in loneliness deeper than any silence could hold. Richard stepped further into the room, his gaze falling on a scarf draped across the arm of a chair. At first glance it seemed ordinary, but the fabric was twisted, knotted tightly, as though gripped too hard by desperate hands. He picked it up and the faint scent of Naomi's perfume lingered, cardamom and vanilla. It should have been comforting. Instead, it chilled him. The house felt different, too quiet. There was no soft music playing from the parlor, no gentle hum of a television left on for company. Even the air seemed still, heavy with something unspoken. The only sound came from a clock ticking steadily in the hall. Each second struck like a reminder of something missing. Wealth had filled these rooms with polished surfaces, art on the walls, and furniture chosen to impress. Yet none of it could hide the emptiness pressing in. Richard felt as though the house itself was holding a secret, waiting for him to uncover it. The scarf in his hand tightened that suspicion. Nothing here was as perfect as it appeared. Richard moved closer to Naomi, lowering himself to her side. He reached out, sliding his arm gently around her shoulders. For a moment she allowed it, but her body remained stiff. Her hands did not return the embrace. Instead, they trembled against her lap, cold and unyielding. The distance between them grew sharper, though he sat only inches away. He whispered her name, hoping she would meet his eyes. Naomi turned slightly, offering a fragile smile that did not reach her face. When he asked what happened, she shook her head quickly, Her voice came low, rehearsed, as if borrowed from another time. "I slipped. It was an accident. Nothing serious." The words fell heavy in the air. Richard wanted to believe her, but every part of her body betrayed the truth. The bruises, the trembling hands, the way she avoided his gaze. It was a lie, wrapped in fear. Doubt cut through him like ice. He pulled her closer, but the embrace felt empty. Love had not disappeared, yet something darker stood between them, and it refused to let go. The silence stretched between them until it felt unbearable. Richard tried to steady his breath, but the weight in his chest refused to lift. From the open window, faint voices drifted in. Two of the staff walked slowly through the garden below, their words meant to be private, yet carried by the night air. "She doesn't smile anymore," one said softly. "Not like she used to." The other hushed him. "Careful. If the old lady hears, there will be trouble." A pause, then a sigh. "But it's true. Poor madam. Everyone notices." Richard froze. His grip on the armrest tightened until the leather creaked. The words struck him harder than Naomi's fragile denial. Others had seen it. Others had whispered about it. This wasn't just in his imagination. He looked back at Naomi, who sat staring at the floor, her hands folded over her stomach. She had heard the voices too, but she did not react. That silence told him more than her excuses ever could. A knot formed in his throat. Whatever was happening to her was not an accident, and no part of his fortune could shield her from it. The truth was closer than he wanted to admit. Morning arrived pale and thin, a light that touched every corner but warmed nothing. Richard sat at the kitchen table, his laptop closed, though he pretended to read. Across from him, Naomi moved quietly, her steps measured, her face calm in a way that felt practiced. She placed slices of bread into the toaster, buttered them with a hand that shook almost imperceptibly. When the knife grazed her wrist, she flinched. The movement was quick, almost invisible, but Richard saw it. He noticed how she straightened her back immediately, how she pressed a smile onto her face as though nothing had happened. Every gesture carried the same rhythm. Too careful, too rehearsed. She poured tea, but never drank it. She adjusted a napkin that didn't need fixing. She wiped the counter twice, though it was already spotless. Richard studied her in silence. The routine was perfect, almost mechanical, but it revealed more than it concealed. She wanted him to believe everything was normal, yet the act itself betrayed her. The kitchen smelled of toast and tea, yet it felt colder than any empty boardroom Richard had ever known. Wealth could dress the room, but it could not disguise the fear lingering in Naomi's trembling hands. Richard folded his hands on the table, his eyes fixed on Naomi. He asked if she had slept well. She nodded quickly, eyes lowered. He asked if she was hungry. Another nod, the same practiced motion, as if she had prepared these answers long before. Her words, when they came, were clipped and short. "I'm fine." "Don't worry." Nothing more. The tone was steady, controlled, without hesitation. Yet each sentence carried the weight of someone who had rehearsed it too many times. Richard leaned back in his chair, watching the small details. The way Naomi avoided his gaze, the way her hands folded neatly in her lap, fingers pressed tight to keep them from shaking. The silence between them filled the kitchen louder than any conversation could. He wanted to press further, to demand the truth, but every instinct told him that if he pushed too hard, she would retreat deeper behind the walls she had built. And so he stayed quiet, feeling that invisible barrier stretch wider with every passing second. They were sitting only a few feet apart, yet it felt like a gulf divided them. Love was present, but it could not cross the silence that Naomi clung to. The silence stretched until Richard could no longer bear it. He excused himself softly, leaving Naomi at the table. His steps carried him down the hall into the study, where the morning light fell flat against the shelves. He closed the door behind him and let out a breath he had been holding since the night before. In the corner sat the black security monitor, its screen dark, patient, waiting. Months earlier, he had installed cameras around the mansion, more out of habit than need. They were meant for safety, a precaution against intruders. He had almost forgotten they were there. Now, the thought struck him with sudden force. If Naomi's words could not tell the truth, perhaps the cameras had already spoken. Richard rested his hands on the desk, eyes locked on the silent machine. His thumb hovered over the power button, hesitant. A part of him feared what he might see. Another part needed proof, something undeniable, something that would tear down the wall of silence. Finally, he pressed the button. The screen flickered to life, a glow cutting through the dim room. Rows of images appeared, each corner of the house captured, waiting to reveal what had been hidden. The screen filled with familiar scenes. The kitchen, quiet in the early hours. A housekeeper moving through the hall with a basket of laundry. A delivery signed at the gate, the box carried inside without thought. Shadows drifted across polished floors as the day wore on. Everything looked ordinary, too ordinary. Richard leaned closer, his hand on the mouse. He sped the footage forward, hours collapsing into seconds. The house breathed in silence, the sun sliding across windows, servants coming and going. Nothing out of place, nothing that explained Naomi's trembling hands or her bruised face. He pushed further, his pulse quickening. The screen flickered with routine, yet he could not shake the feeling that something darker was waiting. Then the feed shifted. Afternoon light stretched across the kitchen tiles, the clock on the wall marking 3:15. A shadow appeared at the edge of the frame. Richard's finger stilled over the mouse. The figure stepped inside, deliberate, assured, as though the house belonged to her alone. Richard's breath caught. His heart began to pound. He froze the frame, the glow of the monitor casting his face in sharp relief. What he saw made his blood run cold. Richard pressed play. The figure moved into the kitchen with the ease of someone who belonged there. Catherine Hayes. Her posture was perfect, her pearls gleamed against the collar of her blouse. Every step carried authority, as if the marble floors had been laid beneath her feet alone. There was no hesitation in her movements, no glance at the cameras above. People who believed they owned everything never thought about being watched. She set her purse neatly on the counter, smoothed her jacket, and looked around the room with quiet judgment. Naomi appeared in the frame, her body stiffening at the sight of her mother-in-law. She tried to smile, but it was weak, fading almost instantly. Catherine moved closer, her expression calm, polite, even warm. At first glance, it looked like a normal visit between family, but Richard's stomach tightened. He knew his mother's body language too well, the way her chin tilted down, the way her eyes narrowed ever so slightly. What appeared graceful to others was the first sign of a storm. The house looked calm, but in that silence something sharp was forming. Catherine's presence filled the room like a shadow creeping across the floor. For a moment, Catherine's lips curved into what might have been called a smile. She said a few words, light and casual. Naomi nodded, trying to answer, her hands fussing with a teacup as though holding it could steady her. Then the change came. Catherine's head tilted, her brows pressed together. The smile thinned, disappeared. She leaned in slightly, her finger pointing toward Naomi's chest, sharp and dismissive. On the camera, there was no sound, but the message was clear. Each movement dripped with contempt. Naomi's shoulders rose, her body pulling back. The room had shifted in an instant, the warmth gone, replaced by something colder than the marble beneath their feet. Richard leaned closer to the screen. His jaw tightened as he read his mother's expression. He had seen it in business meetings when she cut down rivals with a single phrase. Now that same expression bore down on Naomi. The footage held steady, the silence amplifying every small gesture. It was no longer a family visit. It was a performance of power, and Naomi was its unwilling audience. Richard kept watching, his breath caught in his chest. Catherine closed the space between them. Naomi backed away, but not fast enough. Catherine's hand shot forward, gripping Naomi's arm. Then, with practiced force, she shoved her back against the counter. Naomi's face twisted, her free hand pressing against her stomach to shield the life inside. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. He could almost hear the sound, though the camera gave him nothing but moving images. Then it happened. A slap. Quick, flat, unceremonious. Naomi staggered, steadying herself on the counter's edge. Her eyes squeezed shut, her lips moving, but no sound carried across the footage. The silence made it worse. Richard pressed his palm against the desk, his knuckles white. He rewound, slowed it, forced himself to watch again. The image burned into him. His mother, elegant pearls and perfect hair, striking the woman he loved. The footage had no voice, but the violence screamed at him. It was undeniable. The bruise he had seen the night before now had a source, and it was someone he had trusted more than anyone else. Footsteps crossed the hallway outside the frame. 2 housekeepers passed, their whispers carried faintly through the open garden window. "She's covering her cheek again," one murmured. "I saw the mark." "Don't say it too loud," the other warned. "If Mrs. Hayes hears, we'll be out by morning." Richard sat frozen, the words cutting through him like shards. It wasn't just him. The staff had noticed. They had been watching the bruises appear week after week, and none of them dared to speak. On the footage, Naomi stood still, her face turned away, trying to compose herself. Catherine loomed in the background, her arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the unfinished crib as though it were an insult. The house felt heavy, suffocating. Even through the camera, Richard sensed the fear in every corner. He clenched his jaw. The whispers confirmed what he dreaded. This wasn't an isolated act. It was a pattern, a cruelty repeated in silence, hidden behind walls that had seen too much. Richard leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning under his weight. His eyes stayed locked on the paused frame. His mother's hand still mid-air, Naomi bracing herself, fear etched into every line of her body. He could not move. His throat tightened until he could hardly swallow. The woman who had raised him, who had shaped his world, was the same woman tearing it apart. Respect and betrayal collided, leaving him gasping for air. For years, he had admired Catherine Hayes as a pillar of strength. She had built a family legacy, taught him how to command a room, how to carry the Hayes name with pride. But here, on the glowing screen, that legacy cracked. The paradox tore at him. Love for his mother, rage for what she had done. Two forces pulling him in opposite directions, leaving him paralyzed. Richard pressed his hands against his face, shutting his eyes, but the image remained. He could not escape it. He understood in that moment that nothing would ever be the same again. His perfect life was unraveling, and it began with his own blood. Richard did not sleep that night. Each time he closed his eyes, the image of Catherine's hand striking Naomi returned. By morning, he forced himself back to the screen, searching through more footage. What he found tightened the knot in his stomach. The next day played out like the one before. Naomi in the kitchen, moving slowly, her shoulders tense. Then Catherine entered again, polished and controlled. The mask of courtesy lasted only minutes before it slipped. This time, the shove was harder. Naomi stumbled against the counter, catching herself just in time. Catherine blocked her path in the nursery doorway, her finger stabbing the air. The footage showed her lips forming words Richard didn't need sound to understand. "You don't belong here." Naomi pressed a hand to her belly, steadying herself like someone trying to protect fragile glass. Catherine's movements grew sharper, quicker. Another slap, another bruise. Richard paused the video, bile rising in his throat. It wasn't an isolated outburst. It was a pattern. A deliberate cycle of cruelty carried out when he was gone. The truth was worse than he feared. It wasn't ending. It was escalating. Richard sat back in his chair, pressing his palms against his eyes. He thought about storming into the room, confronting Catherine face to face, but he knew what would happen. She would cry. She would twist the story. She would turn blame into theater, and those who hadn't seen the truth would believe her. He needed more than outrage. He needed evidence that could not be denied, something that would speak louder than tears or excuses, something no one could refute. His mind worked through the possibilities. Each scenario ended with Naomi suffering more unless he planned carefully. He breathed slowly, steadying himself. The cameras were his answer. They had already revealed what words could not. If he could capture everything, without gaps, without shadows, then the truth would stand on its own. Richard's heart pounded, but his resolve hardened. This wasn't about protecting his reputation. It was about protecting Naomi and the child she carried. From this moment forward, every choice he made would be deliberate, quiet, strategic. He would not confront in anger. He would wait. He would prepare. The next morning, Richard rose before dawn. He kissed Naomi's forehead, told her he had a full day of meetings in the city. His voice was steady, his footsteps deliberate as he left through the front doors. The staff watched him go, the sound of the car rolling down the driveway echoing across the estate. But he didn't drive far. Just around the corner, beneath the branches of an old oak, he stopped. His tablet glowed in the dim light, each camera feed lined up like windows into the truth. He leaned forward, eyes fixed, breath slow. The house looked calm. Gardeners trimmed hedges, a maid carried linens through the hall. Too normal. He knew that calm could shatter at any second. Every tick of the clock dragged. Richard's jaw tightened, his grip on the tablet firm. He felt both fear and determination twisting together in his chest. Then, in the distance, a silver sedan turned into the driveway. Catherine's car. Smooth, slow, deliberate. Richard's pulse quickened. The trap was set. Now all he could do was watch and wait for the truth to reveal itself. The silver sedan rolled through the gates, its engine humming with quiet authority. Richard watched from his hidden place beneath the oak, the tablet steady in his hands. On the screen, the front camera showed Catherine stepping out of the car, polished as ever, pearls resting against her neck. She did not pause at the door. She did not knock. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out a key. The door opened with ease, her heels striking the marble floor like they owned it. Every movement carried the same message. This house was hers, not Naomi's. Richard's jaw clenched. Each second confirmed what he already knew. Catherine came and went as she pleased. She carried herself not as a guest, not even as a mother, but as the master of a domain she could no longer control. The cameras followed her through the hallway, her steps measured, confident. She adjusted a frame on the wall, straightened a vase on a table, small gestures of ownership. Then she turned toward the kitchen, where Naomi's figure waited, fragile and unaware. Richard's heart pounded. He leaned closer to the tablet. The stage was set. In the kitchen, Naomi poured hot water into a teacup, steam rising in delicate curls. Her shoulders were tense, though she tried to steady her hands. The sound of heels clicking across the marble floor made her flinch. Catherine entered, her expression sharp beneath the polished calm. She spoke first, words Richard could not hear but could read in her face. A smirk tugged at her lips, followed by a narrowing of her eyes. Naomi lowered her gaze, murmuring something, her hand resting against her stomach. Catherine stepped closer. Her finger jabbed the air. Naomi tried to retreat, but the counter trapped her. The exchange escalated quickly. Catherine shoved her, and the teacup slipped from Naomi's hand. Porcelain shattered against the floor, shards scattering across the tiles. Naomi bent down, desperate to gather the pieces, but Catherine yanked her upright. The grip on her arm was hard, merciless. Naomi's face twisted in pain, her lips parting in a silent cry. Richard's breath caught as he watched. The soundless footage was brutal in its clarity. This was no misunderstanding. This was cruelty laid bare. The footage grew darker, more dangerous. Catherine's hand left Naomi's arm and moved toward the knife block on the counter. Her fingers closed around the handle of a long blade. Slowly, she lifted it, the steel catching the light. Her face twisted, the mask of social grace slipping away. Her lips formed words Richard could almost hear in his head, words heavy with contempt. Naomi froze, her hand pressed tight to her belly, her body trembling. Richard gripped the tablet harder, his knuckles white. Every instinct screamed at him to run inside, to tear the weapon from his mother's hand. But he forced himself still. He needed the proof, the undeniable evidence. On the screen, Catherine raised the knife slightly, as if weighing more than just the steel in her hand. Her posture radiated menace, her shadow stretching across the kitchen floor. Naomi's eyes widened, filled with terror. Richard's pulse hammered. The tension snapped taut. The woman who had once been the center of his family now stood revealed as its greatest threat. Richard could no longer wait. The sight of the knife in his mother's hand ripped away every restraint. He stormed through the side entrance, his footsteps hammering against the floor. His voice shattered the silence. "Enough!" Both women froze. Naomi stumbled back, her arms wrapping around her stomach as tears spilled down her face. Catherine turned sharply, her eyes wide, caught in the act. For the first time, her control faltered. Richard advanced, his voice steady but sharp. The weight of his anger filled the kitchen. Catherine's hand trembled, the blade still hovering. Naomi pressed herself against the counter, shaking. Every part of Richard screamed to protect her. He stepped between them, his shoulders rigid, his chest rising with each breath. Catherine tried to regain her poise, but the knife in her hand betrayed her. The room held its breath. Catherine's authority had ruled for years, but now it crumbled. Richard's voice carried a power greater than her silence. The confrontation had reached its breaking point. The mask of elegance could not survive the truth standing inches away. Richard raised his hand and pointed toward the ceiling. His voice cut through the heavy air. "Every moment is recorded. Every shove, every slap, every threat, it's all here." Catherine's eyes followed his gesture to the tiny red light blinking above. Her face drained of color. The knife slipped from her grasp and clattered against the marble floor, the sound sharp and final. She tried to form words, but nothing came. Her lips moved, searching for excuses, but the evidence was undeniable. The cameras had captured everything. There would be no rewriting the truth. Richard's chest heaved, but his voice stayed low, steady, stronger than her crumbling authority. He stepped closer, shielding Naomi with his body. Catherine's hands shook. For the first time in her life, she looked small, stripped of power. Richard's gaze did not waver. The years of respect, of loyalty meant nothing now. He had chosen. And in that choice, Catherine Hayes stood exposed, her cruelty lit up for all to see. The knife lay silent on the floor, but the echo of its fall lingered in the room. Naomi's knees buckled. She collapsed into Richard's arms, her body trembling as sobs broke free. He caught her, pulling her close, holding her as if he could shield her from everything that had passed. His heart pounded against her ear, his breath uneven. The house, once filled with authority and control, now stood frozen in silence. Catherine did not speak. Her figure loomed near the counter, but her presence no longer carried weight. The power had drained from her, leaving only the shadow of what she once commanded. Richard tightened his hold on Naomi. He pressed his cheek against her hair, whispering words she could not yet hear over her tears. His embrace spoke what his voice could not. She was safe. In that stillness, nothing moved except their hearts beating together. The empire of wealth and reputation had crumbled into dust compared to this moment of fragile love. For Richard, the battle was far from over, but the darkness inside his home had finally been dragged into the light. The silence broke with a distant sound. A low wail cut through the night, growing louder with every passing second. Richard held Naomi tighter as blue and red lights flickered against the tall windows. The mansion's marble walls glowed under the flashing colors, a house once untouchable now laid bare. The sharp squeal of tires against gravel echoed from the driveway. Doors slammed shut, heavy footsteps followed. Richard guided Naomi to a chair, whispering that she was safe, though his own chest still heaved with anger. Two uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence filling the space with authority. Their radios crackled, their voices calm but firm. Catherine stood by the counter, her pearls crooked, her posture rigid. She tried to lift her chin, but her hands betrayed her, trembling against her sides. Richard handed one officer his tablet, the screen glowing with the damning footage. The officer's jaw tightened as the images rolled by. Every shove, every slap, every moment of cruelty played out in silence but needed no explanation. The sirens had carried judgment to their doorstep. The law had entered, and the house could no longer hide its darkest secret. The officer stepped forward, his voice clipped. Catherine's lips parted, but no sound came. Her face paled as the metal cuffs clicked around her wrists. The sharp snap echoed through the kitchen, final and merciless. Through the open doors, neighbors had gathered near the gates. Their murmurs traveled like smoke on the wind. "So, it's true," one woman whispered. "All those bruises weren't accidents." Another shook her head slowly. "Money can't cover everything. Not this." Catherine's gaze darted to the crowd outside, her cheeks burning under their stares. The pearls at her throat looked less like symbols of grace and more like chains of hypocrisy. The officers guided her firmly toward the door. Her steps were slower now, the confident rhythm gone. Each movement was shadowed by the whispers curling through the night. Richard stood in the doorway, Naomi leaning against him. He did not speak. He only watched as the woman who had once ruled every corner of his world was led out under flashing lights, her empire cracking with every step. Catherine Hayes had spent decades building her image. Elegant luncheons, charity events, photographs in glossy magazines. She was the matriarch, the face of refinement, the woman others admired from afar. But, in a single night, that image collapsed. The sight of her, wrists bound in steel, stumbling down her own marble steps, told a different story. There was no grace left, no reputation strong enough to survive the truth. Reporters would not write about her pearls or her posture now. They would write about the footage, about the bruises on Naomi's face, about the knife gleaming in her hand. Richard felt no triumph, only sorrow. This was his mother, the woman who had shaped his childhood. Yet the empire she represented was now stained beyond repair. The Hayes name, once spoken with respect, would be whispered with pity and disdain. Naomi leaned against him, silent tears streaking her cheeks. Richard wrapped his arm around her, holding her steady as Catherine disappeared into the flashing lights outside. The legacy was gone. What remained was broken trust and the beginning of a fight to rebuild something real. The flashing lights faded as the police cars pulled away. Inside, the house felt quieter than it had in months. Naomi sat in the chair, her body trembling from exhaustion. Richard lowered himself onto one knee in front of her, his hands shaking as he reached for hers. Her fingers were cold, fragile in his grip. He held them tight, anchoring her as if to promise she would never stand alone again. His voice cracked, but the words carried the strength of truth. "You're safe now, I swear it." Naomi's tears spilled freely, but her shoulders eased for the first time. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against his. Richard wrapped his arms around her, holding her as though he would never let go. The empire, the money, the reputation, none of it mattered. What mattered was this vow, spoken in the ruins of what once looked perfect. It was a vow born not from power, but from love. Richard whispered again, softer this time, "You're safe." Naomi closed her eyes and believed him. Weeks passed, and the house slowly changed. The air felt lighter, no longer weighed down by fear. Workers finished the nursery. Fresh paint warmed the walls, sunlight spilling through the windows onto a crib polished with care. Naomi stood by the crib, one hand resting on the curve of her belly. The baby kicked softly, and for the first time in months, she smiled. The expression was faint at first, then brighter, chasing away the shadows that had clung to her. Richard watched from the doorway, his heart swelling. This was where life began again, not in headlines or in boardrooms, but in this quiet room filled with promise. He stepped forward, placing a gentle hand over hers, feeling the small movement beneath. Happiness was not in the weight of fortune or the pride of legacy. It lived here, in a child not yet born, in the smile slowly returning to Naomi's face, in the fragile peace they were finally learning to hold. The story of Richard and Naomi did not end with the fall of Catherine Hayes. It began again, in silence, in love, in the small victories of healing. Sometimes, the greatest battles are not fought in boardrooms or on city streets. They are fought inside our own homes. Richard chose love over legacy. He chose to stand with Naomi, even when it meant standing against blood. The choice left scars, but it also gave life to something stronger than wealth or status. It gave them a future built on truth. And now the question turns to you. If faced with the same choice, love or inheritance, truth or reputation, what would you choose? If this story touched your heart, share your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss another story that reminds us of what truly matters. Not fortune, not fame, but the courage to protect love at any cost.